Welcome to the Lead Every Day show. Our mission is to see a world well led. And our strategy to get there? To empower leaders like you to lead every day. So let's get to work.
It's been a week to celebrate here. We had a holiday at the beginning of the week. Now we're dropping the content middle of the week. It's President's Day week, and we are excited to be with you here on the Lead Every Day show. I'm Randy Gravitt.
And I'm Mark Miller.
And Mark, we're sort of in the middle here. We're dropping this in the middle of the week. I think Monday was President's Day. I hope you had a little time off. I'm not sure if you did or not. I know everything was shut down, but actually, if you know the origin of President's Day, it was originally around George Washington's birthday, and I think Lincoln got lumped in, but Washington's birthday will be the 22nd. So we're kind of hitting in the middle here between Monday and the weekend. We'll just celebrate all week here. But I thought it'd be fun for us to talk today about President Lincoln. I know a few weeks ago we talked about the inauguration, and we've had a changeover and everything. But when I look back, there's some things about Abraham Lincoln that are fascinating to me. And I think there's some things that will help the leaders who listen to our show as they think about really the concept of teams. There's some things about Abe Lincoln that were always impressive. And one of the things I think that most stands out to me is the fact that he surrounded himself with people who were not the most likely crew to be surrounding himself if he was like most leaders. But we know that Lincoln was not like most leaders. And so we've got a chance here to dive into this. And I think there's some things that we'll all be able to take away in a practical way as we hang out here for the next little while. So, man, I'm excited to hang out with you and get some perspective on Lincoln from you today.
Yeah, well, and I want to make one more connection to our listeners. According to the Corporate Leadership Council, 84% of organizations say they are team-based. Some studies have that number as high as 90. Now, I don't know that 90% of the organizations in the world are team-based. I would probably agree that 90% of the organizations use teams from time to time, project teams, ad hoc teams, and things of that nature. So I think this is extremely relevant. And then I'll just add parenthetically, and you and I have talked about this a lot over the years, in my experience of working in and around teams for decades, the majority of them are awful. Now, that's another story for another day, but I think what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes may give a lot of our listeners a first step to get their team on the right track. The teams can be so powerful, but you got to get off to a good start.
Yeah, that's great. Let's go back to Lincoln here for a second. So, presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin has written a book about his approach to teams. It's called Team of Rivals. I love that title, really, because he surrounded himself with some of his rivals. I made a note or two here. He had some people that were around him, William Seward, Salmon Chase, Edwin Bates, to name a few. The thing that's interesting to me, Mark, in 1860, when Lincoln was elected, all three of those guys had been his competition. He beat them to become the president and then ends up naming them all three to his cabinet. Here's a couple of interesting things. I'll give a little history here. Thanks to Goodwin. Seward, it says he was supposedly the front runner for the nomination. He viewed Lincoln as a country bumpkin. I can appreciate that. There are a lot of people that would look at me as an old country boy, but I think it's pretty cool. He eventually became one of Abraham Lincoln's closest friends and most trusted advisors. And if you know the story, he became the Secretary of State. So Lincoln has this guy making fun of him. We can probably appreciate that from today's divisive world that we just went through the last 6 months with the elections and everything. But here's this guy, he decides
one more.
rather than be offended, he pulls him into his cabinet. And just real quick, Mark, couple more. Salmon Chase, he made him his Treasury Secretary. They had some incongruence in their beliefs. And then Bates became the Attorney General and gave Lincoln wise counsel, though they really didn't have the same viewpoint on emancipation in a lot of ways. And so just the fact that he surrounds himself with these guys, I mean, I think there's some power in that. And lot of humility, courage, secure, knowing who you are, all that kind of stuff. We'll get into some of that, but I think it's pretty fascinating when we think about the people he surrounded himself with. One of the things that maybe made him such a great leader.
Yeah, I agree completely. So let's go there. I mean, what would it take for a modern leader to actually bring rivals around their team, around their table, and on their team? You mentioned a couple of them. One, it'd take a lot of courage. I mean, you would be choosing a hard path. I think it also would require a belief in the power of teams and really a nuanced understanding that it's the diversity, which we will talk more about later in this episode, but that's where the strength of the team lies. The different experience, the different perspectives. So you'd need a belief in teams and you'd need some courage for sure. What else do you think you'd need?
Well, I think courage, yes, but I think just the self-confidence to know what you're trying to do, and you really do want to get that done. And so if I'll use your word again, humility. If you have the humility to believe that you're secure enough. I mean, again, I think a lot of insecure leaders I've been around, they would never, they whether they want the power or they want the recognition or the glory or whatever, they're really not about the vision. If they're about the vision, they're going to do everything they can to surround themselves with the best people to help them go where they're trying to go. And I think that confidence to be able to do that and to be secure enough, that stood out to me when I think about Lincoln. I mean, obviously all these stories and that we hear now, but there's a reason those stories are still around, is because he thought this way. So that, I mean that to me, I think the emotional intelligence too is one that strikes me. It's like, there's things that you can learn. I'm assuming he was thinking there's things that you can learn from everybody, and he's trying to build a coalition and bring people together. And it's hard for us to even think about that. And again, right, in the world that we've lived in the last, I don't know, decade, 20 years, whatever, it's been so divided, our nation has. And yet here's this guy who's trying to unite everybody in the midst of the most probably divided season in our country's history, maybe you could say, and he's still trying to bring everybody together. I mean, all that kind of stands out to me as well.
In the middle of the war, I mean, you can't even comprehend doing that in peacetime, much less in a time of war. And Goodwin talks about in her book that in the midst of all that, he was able to forge consensus, which I think is interesting, because I know a lot of teams that are not successful because they overuse consensus. And there is a place for consensus, and a lot of people think that consensus is just majority rules. Well, no, that's not consensus. Consensus is when you reach a conclusion that every member of the team can fully support. Now, when you need consensus is when the stakes are really high and the issue is very complex. So this was the perfect season to pursue consensus. But as we've just said, the people around the table would make that even harder.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think when I think about this thing, and you said during a time of war, this is not a war with another country or other countries. Right. This is a war going on in our own. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, you can't imagine, but it's like this guy bringing that consensus. And I think one of the things that is so powerful about this is, rather than trying to silence his critics, he's actually embracing the views of his critics and didn't change his values. He stood on, his principles. But I love the idea that he's listening to what everybody's thinking, and then ultimately he's the leader. You got to make a decision, whether it's through consensus or, we've talked about different decision-making tactics in the past. If you've got the power, you get to make the decision ultimately, but to understand what's going on around you and to even bring in diverse opinions, I think that's the mark of an enduring leader. You wrote about an uncommon leader in uncommon greatness, and I think there's some things about Abraham Lincoln that are uncommon.
He's the perfect example.
Statue. I mean,
he's the perfect example, because he elevated others and the mission above his own self-interest. And that's one of the hallmarks of an uncommon leader.
It's so rare. It's so rare. And we know, all of us know it's really hard because we want what we want. We have our own agenda sometimes, or we don't want to, we don't want to listen, or we've heard and we just have this opposing view. And it's, we'd rather be right than get it right, so to speak. And I think Lincoln really was, it seems like was committed to getting it right. Years ago, I took a year and I actually did a little bit of a deep dive on Lincoln. I read several books about him that year and just sort of put my focus of my reading and my study that year on him. And just these topics we're talking about today, but I mean, just endless how this guy thought correctly. And I'm sure he's been glorified through the years. I mean, these stories, but nobody's a perfect leader, but I love his humility. We mentioned a couple of weeks ago, we're talking about the habits, he just on and on and on. Everything I would read is like, this guy really got it, he understood what he really was trying to do. And there, again, there's a reason there's a monument, and he's been being talked about or still celebrating his birthday, long after he's gone.
Well, let me say this now. I think all that for me is inspiring and appropriate setup for what we're about to talk about. But I'm not Abraham Lincoln. You're not Abraham Lincoln. And I got a sense that a lot of people listening are going to think, well, he can do that, but I can't. And I think we need to nip that right in the bud and say, hold on. There are principles, and there are transferable principles, and there are practices that he demonstrated that I believe, and I think you agree with this completely, there are things that you and I can do, and every leader listening, to really steal a play out of Lincoln's playbook.
Yeah. Okay. So I love that. Let's transition here and try to help the person who's listening to think about their teams. Because as you said before, 90% of people in these organizations, or 90% of these organizations, would say they have teams or at least north of 80%. And yet I want to go back to something you said earlier. There are a lot of teams that are awful. They're just,
the majority. The majority are awful.
Yeah. You've asked the question in the past, though, why does some flourish and some flounder? And it just breaks my heart to think about teams that year after year after year never achieve what they could do. And because of that, I mean, we say this all the time, but when we don't lead well, everybody's affected. And when we get this right, everybody benefits. Well, I think the same is even more true with a team, because we're so much better together. We say this all the time, but we're able to accomplish way more with a group of people that are aligned toward a common goal and who are all on that mission together than we are if we're on our own, just trying to, chop wood by ourselves. We don't. It's just no question. And so let's talk about that. And let's start with a question. Who's on your team? I like that. I like that question to kind of kick us off here. If anybody's listening, let's start with, who do you have on your team? And I would encourage any person to just take out maybe a pad and write down the names of the people on your team. You might even put them in a circle. Like if you think about your inner circle, who is on that team? Who reports to you? Who would that team of people that are trying to help you do what you're trying to do, who would that team be? And I think that's a good starting place with like, what are we really talking about here? Who are these people? And if you start looking at those people, Mark, most of the time, there's a lot of yes men or yes women. There's a lot of groupthink. There's a lot. Diversity is not necessarily the first thing we think about when we want to build our team. We want to think about, who do we want to work with, and who's our favorite, all that kind of stuff. And I think the power is really evaluating, do you have the right people around the table? You want to comment on that?
Well, I would say that single question will probably go straight to the heart of most leaders. I mean, you can make this as analytical as you would like, but I believe that most leaders know in their heart and in their gut if they've got somebody around that table that shouldn't be. And I was talking to a group of leaders just recently, and we were talking about what to do with someone that wasn't a good fit. And the first thing out of their mouth was, well, can't we just fire them? Well, I said, that's always, an option. But I said, hold on, don't do that too quickly. I said, who put them in that spot? Like, was it you or was it someone you trusted? So what's going on here? Like, why is this person not the right person? Are the expectations clear? Do they have the resources they need? Have they been coached appropriately? I mean, there's a lot you can do before you fire them. And again, I think you've got to come to grips with that. Don't move too quickly to terminate someone in this case.
I love the reminder that I need to look myself in the mirror. If I've got people around my table, they're not my people, but it is my table. I've decided, or I've allowed those people to come around that table. If I'm the leader, anybody listening. And so I think you got to ask yourself that question. What have you done to build this team? I mean, the way I look at it, all the best teams I've ever been around have always been built. There's somebody that makes a decision. You said it a second ago, that we're going to be a team-based organization. And Lincoln could have done it on his own. He could have just said, he had to have a cabinet, but they didn't have to work together. We've seen for decades presidents not have, consensus around their table, or diversity around their table, or unity around their table. Fill in the blank. And they still are making decisions and are trying to work with Congress and, all that stuff. I think the fact that you're trying to align people, there's so much power in that. And I would go to a second question, Mark, you and I talked about offline here, but the second question is, who do you want around your table? And if anybody's listening,
before we go there, I want to get there in just a second. I want to anticipate what some people might be feeling when they realize, maybe acknowledge it and own it for the first time, that they don't have the right people around the table. Because that's a moment. And it can be clarifying, but I think it can be hugely frustrating and disappointing. I was coaching a leader at one point who had expressed to me several times over a period of months that he just had lost confidence in his team, and he was trying to figure out what the real problem was. And he called me one Monday morning really, really early. The phone rang. I picked it up, and he said, "I figured it out." And I said, "Well, what did you figure out?" Because I sort of knew, but I wanted him to say it. He said, "I figured out what's wrong with my leadership team." And I said, "Well, tell me." He said, "I don't have the right people around the table." And I said, "Congratulations." And I probably said it even more animated than what I just said here. And he was angry because I was celebrating what in his mind was really bad news. And here's how I asked him to think about that. I said, for the last 6 months, you've not known the problem. Now you do. A problem well defined is half solved. So you've been confused and you've been disoriented and your team has been underperforming for months, and now you know why. I think that is a reason to celebrate. And so if this is the first time you've ever owned the fact that you don't have the right people around the table, celebrate, and then we're going to roll up our sleeves and figure out, how do we fix it?
Yeah, that reminds me, Mark, I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, I used to be an old basketball coach, and I told the story about how I took over a job where the team had not won a game the year before. And it was it didn't take very long at all to realize we are not, first day on the job. Actually, the first day on the job is kind of funny because only 3 people showed up, and you can't play basketball with 3 people. So I'm telling them, you got to go find sisters or cheerleaders or somebody. We got to have more people. And we ended up with 6. But that was not going to be enough. These kids were just not capable of doing what the vision was. What we're going to try to do. And so we had to start developing younger people, and then we got to where we wanted to go. But it took realizing we can't do what we're trying to do with who we have. And so I love that reminder. This is not going to work with who we have around our table. And if anybody's listening that feels that right now, okay, so what do you need to do? And I think the next question, let's go to a second question. Who do you want around your table? Or let me give a little nuance that kind of maybe ties them together. Can you get where you want to go with who you have? And if you can't, then who do you need to help you get there? Mark, there's so much power in identifying your gaps and filling those spots with people who can help you go where you're trying to go. Tell me your thoughts on that.
Well, Yes. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I appreciate you calling it out, but that feels like a blinding flash of the obvious, right? If you're trying to build a team in a sporting context that can win a World Series or a Super Bowl, that presupposes a certain level of athleticism, and that presupposes a certain level of coaching and fitness and training and diet and exercise and sleep. Now, if you just want to get together with the guys or gals and play a pickup game on the weekend, you can put a totally different set of people around the table. And so, yes. I think, and you and I talk about, one of the first things that a leader needs to figure out is, what's the purpose of the team? And if you've got an existing team, then that's a great activity or exercise to do together. But if you're starting one from scratch, we advocate having a charter before the team's ever assembled, and you are asking and answering those types of questions so you know who to recruit and who to select. So absolutely, you need to know where you're going, what you're trying to accomplish.
That's good. I've heard you in the past talk about, let's take our two questions again. Who do you have on your team? Who do you want on your team? I've heard you talk about doing a team audit. If somebody's listening and we wanted them to do a team audit, any thoughts on how to do that? Specifically, what would how would you do that if you were walking into a situation, or maybe you had a situation you've been in for a while and you wanted to do an audit of your team? Give us some thoughts on that.
Well, I think I'll just put a bow on some of the things we've already said. You'll try to figure out, at least conceptually, what are we trying to accomplish? And then you'll say, do I have people who I believe can help us get there? Now, they can get you to where you are today. That's not actually the question. The question is, can they get you to where you're trying to go? You would also look at the skill sets, as you just mentioned. Are there gaps? If you want a huge international presence and nobody on your team's ever been out of your home state, then maybe you need somebody with international experience. Again, that feels like a random example, but I've actually talked to people who have international aspirations and have no international experience. That doesn't mean they can't do it, but it probably means you need some differing perspectives around the table. So look at who you've got, look at your gaps, and then I think moving into, what do you really want from those men and women? And I think that's probably will round out this list with a few attributes. The first one we've already mentioned, it's diversity. Now, I know diversity has many connotations in today's world. I'm talking about diversity in its very broadest sense. I'm talking about education. I'm talking about experience. I'm talking about age and sex and gender and ethnicity, personalities, different temperaments, different Myers-Briggs types. You want as much diversity as possible. And you and I both know that a lot of teams lack any diversity. And that just makes it so much harder to do great work, because it's the combination of those passions and strengths and education and experience. That's where the real power of a team lies. And it's hard to get that. You and I've also talked about, if you're building a baseball team, you wouldn't want 9 second basemen. I mean, you could technically say you're still a baseball team because that's the game you're playing, but you would be awful because of the lack of skill diversity, different skill set to play second base versus pitch or catch or play left field. And so I think the first thing you want is diversity.
Yeah, you probably wouldn't want your center fielder bringing him in to be the closer for sure. Okay, so let's think about that for a second in the context of our team audit. When you think about the diversity around your table, what are you looking for there? And let's throw out a couple of ideas for people to think about. I would say you get to decide who you want around your table and what they need to be about. But let me just throw a couple of broad things out here. I'll start with one. I'm looking for learners, Mark. If I'm going to have a great team and I want to be a growing team, I believe that growing people grow stuff. And so I want to be surrounded by people who are learners. You talked about it as one of our habits a couple of weeks ago, the idea of growing. Your capacity to grow determines your capacity to lead. I think the capacity to reach your potential as a team, it goes way up if you have learners around the table. They're learning from failure. They're learning from success. They're learning to battle complacency, but they're specifically learning their skills about, if they're athletes, they've got position skills. If they're in marketing, they ought to be leveling up their marketing skills. But as a team, we ought to be getting better at the way we do meetings and the way we solve problems. And there's all these things that we can be learning together. But the best teams I've ever been around have been filled with people who are committed to getting better day after day after day. And it's amazing when you add all that up at the end of whatever a season is. You know, if it's an athletic team, we know when the trophies are handed out. But in the corporate world, a lot of times it's an annual, time. We review our employees a lot of times annually, but do we evaluate our team? And I love this team audit time. It is a time to ask ourselves, do we have people learning the way they need to? Is our team learning the way it needs to? And if we take that to the next level, our teams get better. I think Learner is a good place to start. If I'm thinking about diversity around my table, that's one of the things I'm looking for.
But let me offer a little nuance here, just to be sure that we're in sync and we don't bring any confusion. I think you need diversity, as I mentioned a moment ago, but you need everyone to be a learner.
Exactly.
You need all these different types of people with all this different experience and all this different levels of, of skill, but you want everybody to be a learner.
Yeah, we're on the same page there for sure. That's what I'm saying. Every single person in any organization, I always say if they're not growing, they need to be going. I don't think you can go where you want to go to without having learners. I mean, it's just, you'll never reach your potential if you don't continue to grow. So to me, learner is the starting spot for everybody around the table.
Yeah.
Give us another one.
Another non-negotiable that I want from everyone is I want them to be truth tellers. Now, you've got to create a place with sufficient psychological safety so that people will be willing to tell not just you the truth, but they'll tell the other men and women on their team the truth. And so that's a bit of a journey, but I think it should be an aspiration for every team. We know from the research that the higher you go in an organization, the harder it is for you to learn the truth. Well, part of that is because people are afraid to tell you the truth. The best teams, they tell each other the truth.
Yeah, that's great, Mark. I'll give them one more here from my seat. I think if I'm thinking about building a team, I want team players. Now, let's think about this for a second. I know that might even sound simplistic, but I mean, it is simple for sure. I think so many times we underestimate the value of somebody being a team player if we're going to put them on our team. If we put somebody with an individual mindset around our team table, it is going to be really hard. We see this all the time with the diva wide receivers that make it all about me, on a football field. But this happens in businesses everywhere, every day, schools, churches, wherever. You get somebody who's self-serving rather than serving the team. I think I'll say it this way. I've always said when a team comes together, I think they set themselves apart. That's what sets them apart. And it only happens if you have team players. Individual mindset in a team setting makes it really hard to achieve what you're trying to do. So if I'm evaluating my team, I want to make sure that I've got the right people who want to be around a team table, not individual mindset kind of thinkers. So,
and let me just add this. Let me add this. In your reference there, you talked about someone who was self-serving or selfish. And yes, those people exist. But I've actually had an individual on a leadership team who was not particularly selfish or self-serving. He just was an individual contributor. He got no joy, no satisfaction. In fact, he found it very frustrating to have to work with others. But it wasn't that he had a bad heart. He was in the bad seat. And so regardless, if you're building a team, we had to ask him to step off the team. Now, we didn't terminate the guy because he still added value to the organization as an individual contributor. But he could not sit around that leadership table because he didn't want to be part of a team. So that's a little bit different from a heart issue. It was more of a wiring issue. And I don't see that often, but I did encounter it that time.
That's great. Okay, so Mark, before I know you got a book you're going to share with us today. If somebody's looking to build a team, we got a little recommendation. You're going to unpack that here in just a second. But before you do, I want you to share one other thing. I've heard you say before, if you're building a leadership team, and we've seen this before, if your team is a leadership team, let's just think about that in a business. You've always said, make sure you got leaders on the table, and say something about that, because it's amazing how often we get to a group organization that we're working with, and they talk about their leadership team, and you start really evaluating, and they're not always filled with leaders. There's danger in that.
Yeah, there's real danger, and you don't. I mean, you want perspective from all levels and all roles, and you want as much input as you can possibly get. But if you're a leadership team making supposedly strategic decisions for your organization, then you need men and women around the table who are leaders. Now, they may be in varying stages of development or maturity, and you just have to understand that. But you really, if it's a leadership team, a team that leads others, then you've got a couple of questions to ask. One, why would I want a non-leader on my team? Oh, and by the way, why are they leading a team if they're not a leader? So it's another simple thing to consider if you're doing the audit that we've been talking about. Sometimes that's your challenge. You have some individual contributors around the leadership table, and they don't understand the game you're trying to play.
Yeah, that's a good reminder. I think sometimes that longevity gets somebody to that table, and longevity and leadership are two different things. So I just want to remind people, just because somebody's been there a long time doesn't mean they need to be at the table. So again,
exactly.
You get to decide who. Okay, so if I'm building a team, Mark, we got a little book club we do every week. We share a book. I know we got a great one here. I'm excited to hear your recommendation here. Give it to us.
Yeah. So the book is called The Secret of Teams, and it's a book that I had the privilege to author. Let me give you a really quick backstory about, how long ago? In the early 1990s. Goodness gracious, could it be that long? Yeah, a long, long time ago. Chick-fil-A, for those that don't know, I spent about 45 years working for Chick-fil-A Incorporated. And back in the early 90s, we realized that there was a huge upside to teams. And we know from the data and the research that teams outperform individuals well over 94% of the time. And when they don't, it's typically because a leader has messed things up, right? And over influenced the group. So teams outperform individuals. The jury is in. But Chick-fil-A restaurant operators are independent business people. So we began to study teams and share what we were learning. And of course, whether a restaurant operator would choose to build a team, whether a leadership team or organize their entire business around the team concept, was solely at their discretion. Well, in those early days, we knew that most teams were awful. And we spent, as was referenced earlier, we spent a long time on this quest of trying to figure out why most flounder, but we could always identify a few that were extraordinary. We ended up calling those high performance teams. And so we went to work and we quickly determined what set good teams apart from bad teams, because we said every team has three primary elements. First, they have talent, and we've talked a lot about the right people around the table today. The best teams have the right people. The second thing good teams have is they have skills. They have individual skills and team skills. They have individual skills like listening and facilitation and subject matter expertise. If you're the marketing representative on a team, you need to bring marketing expertise. But they also have team skills, things like problem solving and conflict resolutions and how to have great meetings and some stuff that it's not real sexy, but it's really critical to extract and to capitalize on all of that knowledge and wisdom and experience that is resident among those members. So we pretty quickly determined that the good teams have talent and skills, but there was still something else. And after a journey that lasted more than a decade, we actually stumbled upon the idea that we have since given the name community. Community is a very special place. It's where people know each other, they serve each other, they celebrate, they mourn, they actually do life together. And when you add that element to a foundation of talent and skills, you supercharge, you turbocharge the output of the team. And if you go back and look through history, it's real easy to see it in sporting examples, but you think about the very best teams that you've ever been part of, and our bet is that you had all three of those elements. So in The Secret of Teams, we outlined those and some very practical application ideas that any leader can use to move from awful to real team to high performance team. And we hope you'll check that out.
Yeah, that's great. Wow, Mark, how amazing would it be if we had a world full of high-performance team? We always say we want to see the world well-led, but it would be incredible if we just had a high-performance team after high-performance team in all these organizations. I think the world would be a better place. And for you who are listening, I believe that you hold the key, right? I mean, go back to what I said earlier. Teams that last aren't built fast, but they are built. And if you will make a decision to evaluate who's around your table, I believe with all my heart, who's around your table matters. And if you get the right people there, focused on the right mission, you're thinking the right way day after day after day together. Somebody said one time, together is better. I really believe that. And if you can get that group together, aligned, diversity, truth tellers, learners, people that are really in sync together, it is amazing. Again, when we pull ourselves together, we set ourselves apart. And I think your team can be one of those high-performance teams. You looking for that book, Mark? We can go to leadeveryday.com. The books are available there. You and I actually also did a field guide and a quick start guide. If somebody wants to make their organization a teams-based organization, we do a workshop. I mean, all kind of stuff that is available to you there at leadeveryday.com. You can reach out to us, info@leadeveryday.com. And we'd love for you to continue to listen to what we got going on. This is Teams Week. It's President's Week. We've had President's Day. We'll celebrate Washington and Lincoln and all that stuff. But really this week, I want to challenge you to think about your team. If you get your team right, it can make this year so much better and really into your future for decades to come. They might even put a monument of you and your team up someday if you get things right the way Lincoln did. I love that. So we've all got an opportunity here to accelerate our teams, and we hope you'll do that. All right, continue to share, subscribe if you've not done so. Our newsletter comes out. You can subscribe to that at leadeveryday.com. We love this conversation with you. We love all of you. Thanks for listening. Thanks for leading. Remember, the best leaders lead every day.